It's okay if a few people want to sit on the floor in front here, just to make it possible for you to actually see what's going on. There won't be PowerPoint other than this, so you won't be missing anything if you can't see the screen. But I do know it's often better to sit there. Be our guest if you want to sit up here on the floor. But we'll get started, so we start on time. Welcome to everybody. I guess as they say in Jaws, we're going to need a bigger boat. We weren't sure how to gauge the interest in our talk. Obviously, it is well oversubscribed, I'm sure, due mostly to today's guest. So welcome. I'm Avery Goldstein. I'm the director of the newly founded Center for the Study of Contemporary China at Penn. And we're thrilled to inaugurate our speaker series by presenting Justin Yifu Lin, a man who, as the saying goes, needs no introduction. But I'm going to provide one anyway. To be honest, his accomplishments are so numerous and varied that I have to leave out as much as I'll include. So just a few words about Justin Lin's professional life and academic career. Justin Lin served as chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank from 2008 to 2012. He was the World Bank's first chief economist from a developing country. Prior to joining the bank, Professor Lin served for 15 years as founding director and professor at the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University, where he is now also emeritus president of its National School for Development. Professor Lin has been a deputy to China's National People's Congress and has served several national and international committees, leading groups, councils on development policy, technology, and the environment, including, but not exhaustively including, the UN Millennium Task Force on Hunger, the Eminent Persons Group of the Asia Development Bank, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the Global Agenda Council of the International Monetary System, the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee, and the Hong Kong U.S. Business Council. Now, a few things about his academic career here. Justin Lin received his Ph.D. in economics from the University of Chicago. He's a recipient of many honors and has twice won the Sun Yat-sen Prize, the highest award for economists in China. Most recently, he was awarded the Professional Achievement Award by the University of Chicago Alumni Association. Professor Lin is the author of more than 100 articles and 18 books. I won't list them all, obviously. I'll mention just two, the two that are up here. Two recently published, recently meaning within the last year, published in English. There are flyers for the Quest for Prosperity in the corner there. You might want to pick one up as you leave. Let me say just a word about the Quest for Prosperity and then also something about the other book that you will be speaking about today. The Quest for Prosperity, How Developing Economies Can Take Off, is hot off the presses, just published in September 2012. With an endorsement from the economist who is the favorite of all political scientists, Tom Schelling, the Nobel laureate, who says, "This is a truly exciting book, speaking directly to the reader and quoting Lewis Carroll as easily as Simon Kuznets. Justin Yifu Lin proposes a new approach to development economics that makes great sense." And I'll also quote from another political economist, Robert Wade at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I think you'll see why I quote from him. This book is a tour de force, a seminal contribution to the development studies that is engagingly, even entertainingly written. Lin uses words, not statistics, to carry his arguments, and he illuminates abstract ideas with the dicta of people as diverse as Winston Churchill, Deng Xiaoping, and, wait for it, Mick Jagger. Today's talk is based on the book Demystifying the Chinese Economy, which came out earlier in the year, and James Heckman, another Nobel laureate in economics, this one from Chicago, says Demystifying the Chinese Economy is a tour de force. It presents a broad historical perspective over 2 millennia of the rise, fall, and the dramatic resurgence of Chinese economic power. It presents an analytically informative study of the sources of China's economic growth and the prospects for growth in the future. The book challenges many tenets of conventional neoclassical theory. Professor Lin will speak to us today for about 45 minutes, and then afterward take your questions. So without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Justin Yifu Lin to Penn.
Well, thank you very much for the very nice introduction, and it's an honor for me to have the inauguration lectures for these new centers on the contemporary China studies. And as you know that I'm going to talk about one of my new books, the Demystifying the Chinese Economy, because in the past 33 years since the reform started in 1979, and the economic phenomenon in China is very hard to predict and to understand. Because when China started this journey, in 1979, the per capita income in China was only $185 US. It was less than 1/3 of the average in the sub-Saharan African countries, the poorest continent in the world. At that time, the per capita income in China was less than 1/3 of their per capita income. But in the past 32 years, the average annual growth rate in China was 9.9% continuously for the past 3 decades. And no one ever expected that, because in 1979, when China started this reform transition, the target set by Deng Xiaoping was to quadruple the Chinese economy in 20 years. And what did he mean by quadruple the Chinese economy in 20 years? That implied China needed to grow at 7.2% per year continuously for 20 years. In effect, nobody ever believed that 7.2% per year for 20 years could be achieved. They thought Deng Xiaoping was raised this expectation to encourage people to work harder, and even China could not reach 7.2% per year. If China could reach 6%, it would be fantastic. Now we find Deng Xiaoping was too conservative, because China grew at 9.9% continuously for 32 years already. And now the per capita income in China reached $5,400 US last year. And it was more than 4 times of the average in sub-Saharan African countries. And in this period, not only the economic growth rate was very fast, China also engaged in the opening up the economy. Because in 1979, China was quite an inward-looking country. The export contributed only to 4.7% of the Chinese GDP. Import, 4.8%. So altogether, only 9.5%. But in this period of time, the trade in China increased so rapidly. On the average was 17% per year. And as a result, by the time of last year, the trade dependent ratio increased from 9.5% to now more than 50%. And it's very important because among the large economies in the world, well, Japan's trade dependent ratio was less than 20%. US trade dependent ratio was about 25%. And China is more than 50%. So in that regard, China is the most open economy among the large economies in the world. And certainly you know now China became the largest exporter of the world. China was the second largest trading power in the world. And in the past 32 years, certainly, the living standard in China improved a lot. And I have a personal story, because when I went back to China in 1987 with my PhD degree from Chicago, the Chinese government allowed me to bring a car without paying custom duty. At that time, the custom duty was 215%. Certainly, I took advantage of that offer. I brought a car back home, but at that time there was a lot of rate cuts. I went back to Chicago, from US to China in June 1987. It took about 9 months for me to get approved the license for driving a car on the street. And when I went to get the license, the transportation authority in Beijing told me my car was second privately owned car in the whole city of Beijing. That was March 1988. Could you imagine how many privately owned cars in Beijing today? More than 3 million. So my car was a very humble car. It was Toyota. And at that time, the attention I received was more than I was driving Mercedes-Benz, BMW, or even Rolls-Royce. Okay, but not only people like me, living standard improved a lot. Because in the past 32 years, more than 600 million people got out of poverty in China. And we know that we had a millennium goal trying to reduce poverty in the world. If we took out these 600 million people out of this calculation, the number of people living in poverty did not decline. In effect, continue to grow. So China made a very important contribution to the global effort for poverty reduction. And not only the living standard in China, actually China made a very important contribution to the global economy. And two examples. One is that in 1998, East Asian financial crisis. And China at that time did not devalue its currency and provide stability to East Asian economies, avoid competitive devaluation. And as a result, in 1998, most people thought East Asian economy should take more than 10 years to recover. But because of stability that China provided, as well as the dynamic growth that China performed during that period of time, all the East Asian economy started to grow again after 2 years of the crisis. And the other one at this time, since 2008, we encountered this global crisis, and China, was the first country to introduce fiscal stimulus at the end of 2008 with 4 trillion yen of Chinese package. China was the first country to recover, in the first quarter of 2009, and in a way help the other country to regain their ground, to recover from the crisis. And so, in my book, I try to analyze a few big questions. How come it was possible for China to achieve 9.9% growth rate continuously for 32 years already? How come it was possible? And it was not expected, because during the period of time, most people expect China to collapse. But China did not collapse, continued to grow at such a high rate. My second question will be, how come it was impossible for China to have a similar performance before the transition, before the reform started in 1979? And then the answer might be, well, because China started a reform, right? But my third question is that in the 1980s, 1990s, almost all the countries, all the developing countries in the socialist camp or in other developing countries, they all engaged in transition, in reform. And how come many of them encountered the collapse or lost decades instead of dynamic economic growth as China achieved in the past 30 years? How come there's such a dramatic difference in the performance, although they all engaged in the so-called transition and reform? And my first question, everything should have two sides, right? Yes, China achieved a lot in the past 32 years. But what were the prices China paid for this success? And then you can imagine in the newspaper you read a lot, income disparity and global imbalance and so on. How come that China encountered those kind of problems in spite of this miraculous success? And my fifth question, and it's also very important for today's world. Could China continue this kind of dynamic economic growth in the coming decades? It's very important for China, but it's equally important for the world. to get out of current crises, right? Whether it was possible for China to continue this kind of growth rate, let's say 8% or 9%. And my last question, as I mentioned, is that every mentioned I was the former chief economist of the World Bank. Certainly I care about other developing countries. So my question is that, can other developing countries achieve similar performance as China did in the past 30 years? So those will be my 6 questions. The first question, how come it was possible for China to grow so rapidly? For this, we need to understand rapid economic growth is a modern phenomenon. It did not occur in the world until about 18th century. Because before 18th century, even for the advanced economy at that time, like Western European countries, according to historians, their average annual growth rate was only 0.05% per year in terms of per capita income. So what does that mean? It took 1,400 years for people in the Western European countries like UK, France, or Germany to double their per capita income. 1,400 years. And then in the 18th century, early 19th century, it accelerated 20 times, from 0.05% to 1% per year. 1% per year means that the per capita income would be doubled every 70 years. And then entering into the second half of the 19th century and the 20th century, the growth rate of per capita income accelerated again from 1% to 2%. So it reduced from 70 years down to about 35 years. And then we need to ask, how come there was such a dramatic changes from 1,400 years double per capita income reduced down to 70 years, now reduced down to 35 years in the high income part of the world? We know the answer, right? It was because in the 19th century, there was something called Industrial Revolution. So the technological innovation was accelerated. With the acceleration of the technological innovation, the labor productivity increased very rapidly, the income increased very rapidly. So the secret for rapid economic growth in a modern time was because of the acceleration of technological innovation. But if the acceleration of technological innovation was the true driver or the secret for the success of economic performance in a country, a developing country has some kind of advantages. Because for the high-income country in Europe, in North America, their technologies are on the global frontier. If they wanted to have a new technology, they need to invent the technology by R&D, with a lot of investment, with a lot of risk. For a developing country, we know what important is technology innovation in the in next period of production, I use some kind of technology which are better than the technology I'm using now. But it doesn't have to be the newest. So there's some possibility called the advantage of backwardness. A developing country with a technological gap with a high-income country, they can tap into the potential technological gap by borrowing technology, by imitation, by absorption. And they can achieve very rapid technological innovation at a very low cost and at a low risk. So if a country where an economist know how to tap that into the potential, they can grow at twice as high as fast as a high-income country, or 3 times as fast as high-income country. And the statistic, the history show there were certain economies in the world after the Second World War find out a way to tap into that advantage of backwardness and achieve 7% or more growth rate continuously for 25 or more years. there were 13 economies in the world. They benefit from this advantage of backwardness. And China was one of those 13 economies in the world after China started this reform in 1979. So my answer to the first question is very simple. Advantage of backwardness and the ability to tap into the advantage of backwardness. Then we come into another puzzle. Advantage of backwardness has been there for a century, right? After the Industrial Revolution, the Western European country, they took off. Then North America country, they took off. And most other developing world, they did not start the process. And as a result, we have this observation, so-called the Great Divergence. The income in the high-income country and the European country, the gap become larger and larger. And that gap means advantage of that one. It has been there for almost 2 centuries. And it has been there for almost 2 centuries for China. How come China did not benefit from the advantage of backwardness until 1979? My story is very simple. The Chinese government did not want to tap into that potential at all because China, the socialist government, came to power in 1949. After 3 years recovery from the war destruction, China started in 1953 for the national development. At that time, the goal was to catch up and to overtake United Kingdom in 10 years, to catch up the US in 15 years. So what does that mean? It means that China wanted to develop the most advanced industry immediately. And if China wanted to develop those most advanced industry, could China benefit from the advantage of backwardness? For 2 reasons it could not, because most of those industries were still under protection of patent, right? More important than that, most of those industries were considered as national security-related industry. Even China wanted to pay the price for using those kind of patents. China could not get that. As a result, China needed to reinvent the wheel, doing the R&D invention by China itself. So China gave up the potential. And the situation could be even worse than that. Because those advanced industries was very capital intensive, right? China was a poor agrarian economy. Capital was very scarce. So those advanced industries were not China's competitive advantages. Since they were not China's competitive advantages, firms in those kind of sectors were not viable in the open competitive market. The government needed to subsidize them, protect them, and to mobilize resources to help them to make investment. After they had the investment, China, the government needed to subsidize them, protecting them all the time. So with those kind of necessity, the government created all kind of protection distortion to make those industries visible in China. But as a result, first, resources was misallocated away from the sector which China can be competitive to the sector which China cannot be competitive. And it also restored all kind of incentive and create all kind of possibility for rent seeking or even political capture. So with that kind of strategy, yes, China achieved something. China was able to test nuclear weapon in 1960s, although China was a low-income country. China was able to launch satellite in 1970s, although China was a low-income country. But the misallocation of resources and the repression of incentive, so the economic performance in China was very poor. And that was the reason by the time of 1979, although China owned the nuclear weapon, China owned the satellite, but per capita income was only 185. It was less than 1/3 of the African country. That was my answer to the second question. Then becomes another problem. Because we know that in the post-war period, all the socialist countries follow similar strategies. Non-socialist countries like India, like Latin America, like African countries, in effect, they follow similar strategy. Or they call that import substitution strategy. They wanted to develop the capital-intensive sectors, and so they did not have to rely on import of those kind of advanced products. And they carry out those kind of strategy in a name called import substitution strategies. And since those kind of strategies create sectors which went against their comparative advantages, and like in China, they all need to protect them. And as a result, their economic performance were very poor. Not only in China, in all the socialist countries, and not only in the socialist country, in also all the developing countries. So by the time China started reform in the 79, other countries, socialist countries, started in the 1980s, late 1980s, and other developing countries, they started also in the 1980s, entering into the period of reform, the so-called Washington Consensus reform period. And they try to remove all those kind of distortions, right? But what happened to them? Their economy collapsed. Their GDP reduced 40%, 50%. They created huge unemployment. And then they entered into a whole period of very sluggish growth. And so some economists call the 1980s, 1990s was the lost decades for the developing country, because the average annual growth rate for the developing country was lower than the average growth rate of the developing countries in the 1960s and 1970s. Not only so, the frequencies of economic crisis in the 1980s, 1990s was even higher than the frequencies in the 1960s and 1970s. And that's the reason why some economists call the 1980s, 1990s was the lost decades, for the developing country. And how come? They have the same problem, right? They all try to pursue certain kind of industries, development which go against their competitive advantage. They create a distortion and inefficiency, and they want to remove the inefficiency, the distortion. How come China performs so well, and that is so poorly? Again, it was because of the strategies. We know that in other socialist countries, as well as in the developing country, in general, they follow Washington Consensus in the period of reform or transition. And they wanted to remove all the distortion by some kind of so-called structural RP, by privatization, liberalization, marketization, in order for the developing country to remove the distortion to have a functioning market. I think the goal was good, but there are trouble. Those distortions exist for the reason that they have a lot of firms which are not well in the advanced sector, right? And so if we remove all those distortions immediately, what will happen? All those non-viable firms in the old priority sectors will go bankrupt. And they employ 30%, 40% of the workers nationwide. Most of those workers were in the cities. If you allow them to go bankrupt, you're going to have 40%, 50% unemployment. With that kind of unemployment, can you maintain social stability and political stability? Certainly you cannot. And as a result, either you encounter those kind of political stability, instability, or social instability, or the government, after implement the so-called Washington Consensus reform, on the back door, they introduce some other disguised protection and subsidies. And those disguised protection and subsidies were even less efficient than the protection and subsidies used to be. That's the reason why they perform so poorly. And what did China do? Different strategies. What China did was adopt certain kind of strategy called gradual dual track approach during the transition. In recognition that all the firms without protection, they cannot survive. So the government continued to give them some transitory protection and subsidies. and to avoid their collapse, to maintain stability. But China liberalized the entry to the new sectors by the private firm, joint venture firms, or foreign direct investment, and facilitate their development. And those kind of new sectors, in general, are consistent with China's competitive advantages, mostly in very, very labor-intensive sectors, produce very simple product. But because they are consistent with China's competitive advantages, firms are viable, and the sectors are very competitive. So they grow very fast. They grow very fast, create jobs, create revenue, create income, create savings. And with accumulation of income saving, gradually China becomes more capital abundant, more availability of capital. And then gradually those old sectors, they turn from non-viable to viable because the capital availability increased very rapidly. And the government also gradually remove other restrictions. So that's the reason why China achieved stability and dynamic economic growth simultaneously. And I'd like to say, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a perception in the academic circles, and it was totally wrong. The perception in the academic circle at that time was the primary economy, government-led economy, was not as good as market economy. And the worst possible economy was a dual-track economy, as practiced in China. But now the evidence shows, in the transition period, China did very well. China adopted dual-track approach. Vietnam did very well. Vietnam adopted dual-track approach. Cambodia did very well. Cambodia also adopted the dual-track approach. And this is not only East Asian story, because the dual-track approach was not created in China. It was created by Mauritius in the 1970s. Mauritius used to also adopt this kind of import substitution strategy, very efficient. And then from 1971, they started their transition, and they also adopted the approach. So I think that 5 other developing countries or transition economy did not do well because they adopt a wrong policy based on what theory. Okay. And then what are the costs China paid for this kind of success? I think the cost China paid, as you can read from the newspapers, income disparity, over-saving, over-investment, and insufficient consumption, and trade imbalances, accumulated huge trade surplus. Those are the problems in China. In addition to environmental sustainability, those are the common issues for any developing country, right? So now that focus on those imbalances, the imbalances in the income distribution, the imbalances in the investment and the consumption, the imbalances in the domestic economy and the external economy. And I'd like to argue, those are the consequence of the legacy due to the dual-track reform. As I mentioned, for the purpose of protecting the non-viable firm in the order priority sectors, in general, they are very large. And so at the time, the measures the government maintained to subsidize them, protect them. The first one was in the financial sectors. And so, because they are large firms, they are capital intensive, so the Chinese government, in the transition period, institute the large bank system and the equity market. And that is the way to mobilize financial resources to subsidize the large firm, right? And that kind of financial system caused the first only large firm and a firm owned by the rich people will have access to financial services. And agricultural households, small and medium-sized firms in manufacturing or in services, they could not get whatsoever financial services. although 80% of the employment in China were either in small agricultural households or small medium-sized firms. And because they could not get the financial services, so their development were replaced, right? That means what? Those kind of agricultural households and small medium-sized firms, they are the main source of the employment. If you replace their development, that means you replace the demand for labor force, right? And that will have a consequence on replacing the wage growth in China. We know poor people, their main source of income is their labor income. And if you have this kind of institution replace the demand for labor, replace the growth of wages, you replace the income of the poor people. And it became a subsidy to the large companies and rich people, right? Because rich people, they develop large firm, and wage rate is artificially replaced. So they get subsidies from it. And if you ask the poor people to subsidize the rich people's growth, then certainly you're going to get income disparity become larger and larger. Not only through the wage, but also through the financial repression. The interest rate and the capital cost in China was replaced. And so those firms owned by state or by rich people, when they have access to the financial services, they get subsidies. Who subsidize them? Those people who put the money into the financial system and they could not get any financial services. Those people in general are relatively poor. And if you ask the poor people to subsidize the growth of large company and rich people's company, certainly income disparity will become larger and larger. I think that was number one reason for the income disparity in China. In fact, that was the number one reason for the income disparity to become larger and larger in the whole world. Because after the financial liberalization, those kind of arguments, almost every country developed large bank and equity market. And as a result, income disparity in the world become less and less equal. That's one reason. And if your income disparity become larger and larger, income concentration on the rich people and large companies. We know that consumption propensity for the rich people is lower than the poor people, right? So saving increase. And especially if income mainly going to the large companies consumption propensity is even lower than the rich people. And that causing large saving in China. And if they save, they make investment. And so you see that investment in China, saving in China increase a lot. Consumption is a share of GDP decline. And if you make a lot of investment, but domestic absorption is replaced, then those kind of excess supply, excess capacity need to be absorbed by global market. And that contributes to the widening of the trade imbalance in China. But they all rooted in the legacy of those kind of distortion. And similar distortion also occurred in resources sectors. Royalty in China was almost zero. And so whoever can get the license for mining, immediately they become billions. And so that also contributed to the income disparity. And the reason why the Chinese government adopted that was because in the past, the output price of resources was artificially replaced in a way to subsidize the heavy industries. And after the reform in 1980s, it gradually liberalized. Output price was liberalized, but input prices, the access to the resources mining, the price did not increase. So that was the reason. And the third one was some kind of monopoly in telecommunication, in transportation, in financial sectors. So I think that these disparities in China was a legacy of those kind of dual trade. And now I think China should remove those kind of legacies. Because as I mentioned, China now is a high middle income country. And China capital is not so scarce anymore. And many of those kind of sectors in the past, when against China's comparative advantages, firms were not viable. Now most of them already, becomes China's competitive advantages. Firms are viable, so there's no reason for subsidizing them. And also, if China will not remove those kind of distortions, then those kind of disparity is going to cause all kind of social issue, political issue, international relation issues. So I think that China should started to really remove those distortion, move to well-functioning markets. And luckily, in the 12th five-year plan, all those distortion, the government already put on agenda to remove them. And I think that if the environment allows, those will be removed. So now I come into the other question. If China can remove those kind of distortions, how long China can maintain this kind of 9% growth rate or 8% growth rate? How much longer? Certainly, it's important for China because with per capita income of $5,000 US, it's only 1/10 of the US per capita income. And even we measure by purchasing power parities, it's only about 20% of the US per capita income. So to have a high growth rate, it's very important for China to catch up. And especially in the world today, the way out for the global crisis is growth. And China is the most important source of growth. So Greater China can maintain this growth, become not only issue related to China, but also important for the world. And I think potentially, I think that China can maintain another 20 years of about 8% growth rate. And how come I think that China has that potential? Because the data I have, the newest data I have for comparison was 2008. In 2008, based on Angus Madison, the per capita income in China measured by purchasing power parity was 21% of the US per capita income. And that was the same level in Japan in 1951, Singapore in 1967, Taiwan in 1975, and Korea in 1977. On the same levels, the same advantage of backwardness. Japan maintained 20 years of average 9.2% growth rate for 20 years, from 51 to 71. Singapore, 20 years of average 8.6% growth rate. Taiwan, 20 years of 8.3% growth rate. Korea, 20 years of 7.6% growth rate. And I mentioned Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Japan was one or among those 7 economies since the Second World War, tap into the potential of advantage of backwardness. And China joined that group after 79. And so my argument that if China continue to follow the same pattern of the growth as other East Asian economies, and will continue the pattern growth after the 1979. If Japan used the similar potential, could grow at 9.2% for 20 years, Singapore for 8.6 for 20 years, Taiwan 8.3 for 20 years, Korea 7.6 for 20 years. There's no reason to doubt China has the potential to grow at 8% for another 20 years. Certainly, China need to carry out the reform as I just mentioned. Perfect the market system by removing the rebranding distortions. And I said that from my reading, the Chinese government doesn't want to remove those kind of distortions. And by market competition, China will grow, according to the competitive advantages, and China will tap into that advantage of backwardness. So now my last question. We know that most developing countries perform very poorly after the Second World War. And how come they perform very poorly? Just like China. In the post-war periods, they follow those kind of import substitution strategies. They wanted to develop modern industry immediately, and they could not benefit from the advantage of backwardness. And after the 1980s, they followed Washington consensus. They disregard the reason for those kind of protections, and they wanted to remove all the distortion immediately and cause all kind of instability and so on. But if we learn a lesson from the success, not only in China, but in other 12 economies after the Second World War, by first one, develop their industries and their industrial upgrade in technological innovation according to their competitive advantages. Starting with something simple, gradual move up the industrial ladders, then that will allow them also to tap into the potential of advantage for backwardness. And so I'm convinced every country will have the potential to grow at 8% or more continuously for 20, 30, 40 years, and to turn their nation from a low-income status to middle-income status, or even to high-income status in 1 generation, 2 generations. Certainly, every country started with all kinds of distortions. And they can also learn a lesson from the successful transition economy like China, like Vietnam, like Cambodia, like Mauritius, to be pragmatic and to understand there are some sectors which, they exist there because of wrong policy in the past, but they employ so many workers. They need to have a stability, so it might be desirable to continue to provide some kind of transitory protection. But the government should facilitate the entry into the new sectors which they have comparative advantages in order to grow dynamically and to tap into the potential of the advantage of backwardness. And I think every country should have opportunity. And that is what I discussed in my book, The Quest for Prosperities. So far in academic circles, like Michael Spence said, with so many years of studies, we know a lot of ingredients for economic success. But we don't have a recipe. But if you don't have a recipe, how can you cook good dishes? And I hope my talk and my book provide the recipes for the country to combine all the favorite ingredients together and to turn that into a path for dynamic growth. And within 1 generation for the low-income country to move from the low-income status to middle-income status. As I mentioned, in 1979, the per capita income in China was less than 1/3 of the average in the poorest continent in the world. And China was trapped in that kind of status not only for 1 year, for a century. And if China could do that, there's no reason why other developing countries cannot do that. They should be able to turn their fate from low income status to middle income status within 1 generation. And if they know how to develop their economy according to their comparative advantages and continue to tap into the advantage of backwardness, they will have a hope to turn their country from middle income status to high income status in also a generation. So let me stop here and I will entertain the questions from you. The comments.
So I guess to use your term university, I think there's a missing ingredient. I'm not sure it's necessary. But a lot of people will argue democracy to be one necessary ingredient in this recipe for growth. And the fact that Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan can keep growing for many years is because South Korea and Taiwan became democratic in the 1980s. And Japan was a democracy very early on. And so do you think that democracy is a necessary ingredient in this recipe for growth? And then if China remain undemocratic, will China still keep growing like this?
First, the Japan era democratic society up in the 1980s, they had a one-party system for 50 years. And the Korea, Taiwan had a democracy. They have a dictator, right, during those period. And in Singapore, they have a one-party system. Are they truly democracy? In Singapore, if you do not vote for the government, you know you're going to get very poor services in your community. So that's one thing. So what kind of democracy are we talking about?
Competition.
And secondly, it also depends on, you have so many different types of democracy. You have a democracy of Britain, you have democracy of Germany, you have democracy of France. Which democracy you're talking about? You don't know, right? And so that means even a democracy, different countries will have a different contents. And I'm sure China will move to more democratic system by allowing more voice, more representation. But China will not have a system similar to France, or similar to Germany, or similar to UK, because they are different. If they have a different democracy, how come China cannot have a different democracy? I'm sure China will have a different democracy. Okay.
It seems that the future of Chinese economy is not very optimistic because the Chinese stock markets remain, the Shanghai stock markets remain decline, and the Chinese biggest advantage manufacturing now is facing lots of the problem. For example, the Foxconn, when it's moved to the Chengdu, it's very hard for them to get the cheap labor. Even the government forced the government official to move to work in the Foxconn. And in Taiyuan, there is the factory in Taiyuan is lots of the wires and indicates the tension between the factory and the worker. And in the future, China also face the Lewis turning point, and the population structure is changed. So although the Yang Xiaokai has passed away for 8 years, his point about the disadvantage from the behind seems to become true in the future. So how can we solve all these problems and moving forward?
Okay, that's a very good question. My answer is, if the wage rate in China will not increase, can the people living standards in China improve? If wage rate will not increase, can China catch up with us? That is a necessary process for economic development. Okay. And so I think it's a natural process, and it's a driving force for China to continue to upgrade the industries to sector which is more technologically intensive, capital intensive. And China, compared to 15 years ago, 10 years ago, capital is more available. And so labor force turned from relatively abundant to relative skills. And so the wage rate need to increase. And if the wage rate increase, the company want to be competitive, they need to introduce more technologies and more equipment, or they move to sectors which can allow using more technology, more capital. So that's a natural process. Secondly, according to Yang Xiaokai, how come Japan had a financial crisis? Because they don't have the same constitutional reform as in the US and the UK. And according to Yang Xiaokai, the US did not have a financial crisis because US had those kind of constitutional reform. But now US had the constitution, but US also have a financial crisis. How can you explain that? Here is very important. A developing country, by definition, their institution is not perfect. In fact, there's no country in the world where constitutional institution is perfect. It's very easy for an intellectual to build a theoretical model to say, if you do not have this institution, you are going to pay a cost for that. Just like in the 1980s, when you had the Washington consensus reform. It's very easy to build a model to show if you do not have the property, private ownership, if you do not have a competitive market, if you do not have financial liberalization, trade liberalization, you are going to pay cost for that. And they attribute all the problem in the developing country, in a socialist country, for that problem. Okay. But when they implement that, they also have not only the improvement in the economic performance. When they introduce that, the result was a collapse of the system. Okay, then we got into what Yang Xiaokai called the constitutional reform. India had a constitutional reform, right? India inherited the constitution from the Britain. But economic problem in India, no matter corruption, misallocation of resources, I wouldn't say it was worse than China, but at least we have an India friend here. When you say with the constitutional reform, the same constitution as you observe in Britain, did their performance do better than China? So it's very important for us. I think you were there today in our conversation. I think that economists or intellectuals should not use the first best model learned in the textbook and use that as a reference to attribute all the problem in the developing country to say, well, you have the problem because you do not have those first best models. And I like to say, that's an open invitation for trouble in the country. And in that way, the reason why many developing countries did not do well, because they mostly use the first best model based upon the constitution, the institution, or their real economy in the high-income country, is their reference. And as a result, it does not really try to analyze, try to understand what are the causes of the problem in their countries. And try to move those kind of reform, even they have a good intention, they did not do well. Like if you look into the former Soviet Union or Eastern European country, they carry out those kind of constitutional reform as described by Yang Xiaokai. But if you look into the corruption in Russia, it can be even worse than China. And financial crisis, they also had financial crisis several times already. So I think that it's very important for intellectuals not to use idealized first best models and try to use the first best model as prescription for the problem in the developing country. It's better to have a real understanding of what are the problems in the developing country and what are the possibilities for the improvement in the developing country.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Lim. My question is, if China and other developing countries are taking advantage of backwardness, doesn't that produce a disincentive for developed countries to produce and to innovate? And what happens when China catches up to other developed countries when there is no longer such comparative advantage of backwardness? What will happen then?
Well, China need to do the innovation as a high-income country.
Will China have the capacity to innovate if
Why not?
it's trying to follow other countries?
Well, because if China reach the same income status as the US, okay, supposedly, at that time certainly China cannot try to imitate the US because China need to be on a technological frontier like Korea today, or Japan today. And if you want to compete in the frontier technology, very much depends on several things. One, how much resources you put into the R&D. Secondly, how many geniuses you have that can use those kind of money to do the R&D. Third, how large your domestic market is. Because now the frontier technology depends on the standards. And if you have the right to set standards, in the competition, you will have advantages because you have a large domestic economy, first batch of production will be large, economy scale can be there, and then your cost will be lower. then other country without large domestic economy. Okay, those are the three conditions for determining the success. If China reaches the same income level as the US, that means economic size in China will be 4 times of the US. And so resources put into R&D will be 4 times as high as the US, right? And not only so, population in China is 4 times as the US. So cheapness in China is 4 times as the US. And the economic size in China is 4 times as the US. So I don't see how come China cannot compete in the advanced technology as in the US. Right? But how to reach that first? How to tap into the potential first? Move the income level to that. And then the economic size will demonstrate its power.
Thank you for your very interesting and provocative ideas. I do agree, by the way, that your point about India and constitutions is absolutely exactly right, that the problems are not in the constitution which was written starting in 1950.
Right.
The problem was in the import substitution strategy.
Right.
There was between 47 and 91, India basically wasted time.
Right.
But could I invite you to focus more on organizations? We were talking last night about how the number of the Chinese corporations, largely from the state-oriented sector, but some private funds as well, they have come to very large numbers. You mentioned 73 in the global 500. If you think about these corporations, what do you see as the vulnerabilities? The reason I'm asking this is the banking system, the financial system, for instance, is probably not as efficient as it needs to be. So the allocation of capital is not very efficient. Is that really going to be a hindrance in the development of world-class capabilities in these firms? What do you think are the prospects?
So that's why I propose to further deepening of the market-oriented reform, to remove the remaining distortions, and to allow well-functioning market competition to come. And by that, if China have a good competitions, large corporations need to face competition.
Yes.
They are not protected, so they cannot be lazy. Okay. And under this scenario, either they survive, become efficient, or they do not survive to be replaced by private sectors. But as long as the Chinese economy can continue to grow, I'm sure the number of the large companies that will be listed in the Fortune 500 will increase. The first time I paid attention to this was in 2002. At that time, there was only 11 companies in China were listed in the Fortune 500. At that time, the US had 196 listed in the Fortune 500. And I predict there's going to be a cross by the time of 2020. That the number of Chinese firms listed in the Fortune 500 may be about the same as the US. That was in 2002. Most people thought I was too optimistic. But if you look, in 2002, US have 196. In 2010, I don't have the number for the US in 2011. Okay, 2010. Reduced from 196 down to 140, reduced 56. The reason was the economic side in the US reduced from 32% of the global economy down to 23%. And the Chinese Fortune 500 increased from 11 to 54. And it was because of the economic size in China increased from 4.2% to 9.7%. So my argument is yes. If China further the reform further reform to remove the remaining legacy, those kind of protection to the large companies need to face competition. And if they face competition, for the large companies, ownership is not very clear, no matter it's privately owned or state-owned. But as long as they have a good competition will produce sufficient information for the management. And then the owners, no matter is stockholders or the government, can based on those kind of information to design incentive structure for the management. I think that's more important for that. I had a book on that called the Sufficient Information and State-Owned Sector Reform to argue that competition is more important than the ownership reform. Okay.
I have a question about the early history of the economic reform.
Yeah.
Because some scholars argue that economic reform in some ways started in the early 1970s in China. Mm-hmm. That Mao's decentralization policy actually was very important. Mm-hmm. That township and village enterprises, which were the foundation of the economic reform, already were emergent in the mid-1970s. So there is a kind of past dependency explanation of China's economic reform. And then after Deng Xiaoping launched reform officially, in 78, 79, there were gradual contingencies in the process. Yeah. That's why, we have the idea of crossing the river by picking stone. Yeah. So I'm very curious about the recipe for the future, to the extent that if this past dependency explanation is valid, can we sort of argue that China's model is replicable?
I think that certainly there are some scholar hold that view. They think the success was because, like Jeffrey Sachs, only because China has so many farmers. Okay, and then some other people say, well, China was successful because we had township and village enterprises. In a way, theoretical research by the economist or any social scientist or any scientist always try to observe some kind of correlation between facts and build a model to say it was a causality. But whether it's a true causality is questionable. As I mentioned, Vietnam was also very successful. Vietnam did not have a township and village enterprises. Cambodia was also very successful. Cambodia did not have township and village enterprises. Mauritius was also very successful. Mauritius did not have a township and village enterprises. So the way to examine those kind of hypotheses is to make inferences. Use more data to test that. And if they were equally successful and they did not have township and village enterprises, and how can you say the township and village enterprises was the main reason for the success of China? That may facilitate a little bit, but I don't think that they are convenient. And I can give you an example. Rwanda, since 1994 to now, 17 years, also grew at 9.8% per year for 17 years already. They do not have enterprises. And how can you explain? The only explanation that we can have is that they were able to develop sectors which are consistent with their competitive advantages. So the industry can be very competitive. It can be in agriculture. It can be in some kind of simple service sectors, tea, agriculture, those kind of things, or tourism. But they are consistent with their competitive advantages. And in this process of development, they continue to absorb new technology globally. And that is what I call advantage backward. So that might be a better way. Certainly, we know that, including myself, started with observation or correlation and try to understand whether that correlation really contribute to the causalities. But the way to examine whether they are true causality or not is to put your model into a much wider context and to see that in a much wider context whether they are still valid or not. And based on this criterion, I don't think that township and village enterprises was the main reason for the success in China. India, since the 1990s, 91 also grew at about 8%, 9%. India did not have township and village enterprises. And how can you explain that? We want to have a theory can explain another phenomenon. We don't want to have a theory explain one phenomenon at a time, right? Okay.
Thank you.
I have a question more about your theory. So I feel you identified several stages for the developing countries to develop. Like initially, you propose that they should take on this kind of dual tracking approach, and after years of growth, they should have more market-oriented reform. So my question is, what kind of standard do you use to judge at what point they will be able to transition from this kind of dual tracking approach to the more market-oriented reform?
Okay. The best way is to be pragmatic, to be open-minded to what are the realities. In the early stage, to maintain certain distortion, the benefit outweighed the cost, right? Because if China did not use those kind of dual track approach, then China may immediately encounter 30 or 40% unemployment rate. And we know that is not good for the growth. But now, as I mentioned, after 32 years of very successful development, first, state-owned sectors reduced from about 60% of GDP down to now about 25% of GDP. And in effect, a lot of state-owned sectors, like in automobile and so on, they used to be non-viable. Now they become viable. So you don't need to give them protection anymore. And you should introduce market competition and to force them to, to further improve. At the same time, because those kind of protection, those kind of distortion cause income disparity, cause disparity between saving and consumption and so on. And China pay a lot of cost for that. And so it's time to find that the cost is much larger than the benefit. And it's time to do that.
How can you calculate this equation between cost and the benefits?
If you go to China, you know that. I cannot do that calculation here. And if you're in the system, you observe that, you know that.
Is there any quantitative data that you use to judge? Because all the income disparity or economic growth, they're all pretty value judgment.
Okay. For economists or for any theorist, there are three levels of abilities. One is to build a model to explain the causality, which factor is going to have a positive effect or a negative effect. That's the first abilities. The second ability is to assess how large the positive effect or negative effect. The third ability is to understand how fast those kind of effect will occur. And here that, if you want to assess how large is the positive effect or negative effect, in general is export. You cannot do that ex ante. And especially for how fast, you cannot do that ex ante. But if you want to be a good politician, you need to know how large and or how fast. So there's something odd here. If you ask me how large, only things happen I can tell you, right? And there are always something which you cannot perfectly measure. And so it's very important to cultivate an ability for making judgment. And that judgment is very something like an art, right? And that distinguishes the good leaders and the bad leaders. If you have good intention, just like in the 1950s, they all wanted to develop heavy industries. Can you say heavy industry is wrong? If a country wants to be a modern country, they need to have those kind of industries. But it's too early, right? So those kind of sense is very important. Okay.
So in your talk, you explained low domestic consumption by the income inequality, and I also recognize that you credit this low income disparity to the dual track economy rather than as a natural outcome of economic growth. So that can lead to different conclusions about policy implications.
I did not fully catch that.
You use the dual track economic growth, economic design as an explanation for the high income inequality rather than explain it as a natural outcome of economic growth. Because we know as economic growth, there tend to the high inequality.
This can be, we can build a model and also a bigger evidence to show that. In general, theoretical model will predict if you follow your competitive advantage in growing the economy, then you can achieve equity together with dynamic economic growth. And the reason for that was because for a low-income country, the sector which they have competitive advantages in general labor-intensive sectors. And if you develop labor-intensive sectors, since they are consistent with your competitive advantages, you will be very competitive, but at the same time can create a lot of jobs. We know low-income people, their main source of income is from their wage earning, right? So if you create a lot of jobs for them, they can benefit from the growth. At the same time, because it's very competitive, capital will be accumulated very fast. So capital will turn from relative skills into relative abundant. Labor force will turn from relative abundant to relative skills. And in that process, wage rate will increase very fast. And you can see, poor people, their income mainly from the labor wage earning. Rich people, their income mainly comes from capital earning. And you see that if the wage earning can increase much faster, then the income distribution will improve because the low-income people, their share in the functional distribution will become larger and larger. This is a theoretical model. And then you can see in East Asian economy, starting from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, during their rapid growing period, their income distribution also improved. So it's not only a theoretical model, but also empirically tested. Then we come into China. As I said, China developed the economy according to the China's competitive advantages in the dual track, the new entry part. That part certainly benefits the poor people. But the protection to the old sectors created this distortion as I just described. And so you can attribute, you can build a model to test my hypothesis. It's a hypothesis, but it's testable. Okay.
Thank you very much. You said that you are very optimistic about China's future growth. But do you see any major risks? Any major risks?
In the U.S.?
No, in China. What's the worst case scenario about China's future?
Well, certainly China has a lot of risk, like any country has a lot of risk. So we always need to be cautious, right? As I mentioned, income disparity can be a very big issue in China. So China needs to tackle that. And in the global economy, the slowdown in the U.S. in a high-income country can also put a pressure on the Chinese economy. I'm optimistic about the potential. But whether the potential can be realized very much depends on the policy as well as the environment. And the government need to be adaptive, need to do the policy contingent on the opportunity and the challenges. So we need to see both sides. Need to see the potentials, but at the same time pay attention to the challenges. And try to cope with the challenges at the same time to tap into the potential. Okay, the lady, back.
Thank you for your insightful speech. I'm a Chinese exchange student with Penn, and I think my question results from the confusion of my generation in China that in a fast developing reality, it's better for us to go abroad and enhance our academia skills. Like in US, they recognized a frontier of academic, but isn't it better for us to just live in China and study? We know China has institutions like CCER, which focus on Chinese problems. We have like special problems which require special solutions. So for nowadays, university students, I want to see your suggestion for the future choice of the roles. Thank you.
It's a very good question. And let me tell you a story. George Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, he gave a talk at the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University. And he discussed economic development. And then he told one joke I like very much. He said that how come the Taiwanese economy performs so well, and Latin American countries, they perform so poorly? The main reason was those Taiwanese students came to study economics in the U.S., they stayed to teach in the U.S. And only those engineers, they went back to Taiwan and to become ministers. And then Latin America just the opposite. Those people from Latin America to study engineering stay in the U.S., and those economists went back to Latin America to become ministers. So do you study engineering? Okay.
So it seems that what you've said is you're optimistic about potential, but it depends on further deepening of the reforms in ways you talked about. But in the United States, there are some who are pessimistic about China's potential based not on the reforms themselves, but on demography, the aging of China's population, that drag on growth that's going to represent. How do you deal with that?
I think that certainly it put a little bit pressure, but I don't think it's going to be a big hurdle for three reasons. The first one, China currently has a very early retirement age. For female, 50 years old, and for male, 55 years old. So if labor supply becomes an issue, it's possible to extend the retirement from 50 to 55, from 55 to 60, right? And that will overcompensate for the shortfall in the labor supply. Secondly, China can also revise the one-child policy, because the reason why the aging came to China so quickly was because one-child policy. So the Chinese government can relax the control of that. And you can see the Chinese government actually already started to do some modification in one-child policy. The husband and the wife both came from one-child families. Now they can have two births instead of one birth. And you know that 15, 20 years from now, then that will mitigate the slowdown in the population growth. That's the second policy. But the more important policy is the substitution between quality and quantity. China can invest in education to enhance the human capital. And that is more important than the quantity of the labor force, right? So I would say, what really can be a challenge or threatening or something you cannot expect, then you have no way to cope with that. But it's something that you can predict. You can always, find policy responses. And by those three policy responses, I don't think aging is going to be a main barrier for the growth in China. Okay.
I have two questions actually. The first one is about rural economy. So we know China actually developed based on the two-sector model, which is develop industrial economy at the cost of sacrificing agriculture. And currently, China, the productivity of agriculture in China is still very low compared with the developed economies. So how do you comment on the future growth of rural economy in China, and particularly what government role should play in that growth? And my question is more internationally. My question is, as China has grown so fast in the past decades, it certainly will trying to find recipe for other developing countries. But how China got to position itself in the multilateral framework? We know that during the financial crisis lately, China does not contribute that much into IMF or EU. So, how China see itself in the future multilateral framework?
Well, I think for the first question, certainly China needs to bring new technology to the rural sectors. China needs to allow all migration of labor force, so those people retain in agriculture can increase the size of their farm. And that is the way to improve the labor productivity in agricultural sectors. And that is the way for any country to improve agricultural technology, rural income in any country. So China needs to follow the path. The second one, I think we need to assist. In effect, China made the largest contribution to the global recovery, right? By this fiscal stimulus, by maintaining dynamic economic growth during the global crisis. You know that we now have a German miracles, right? During the global crisis. Germany maintained very high growth rate, very high employment. And according to Michael Spence, the Nobel Prize winner, he said the secret for the German miracle is the growth in China. So China already made a very important contribution to the global recovery. And whether China should contribute more to the IMF rescue? Well, China contribute. And, but China certainly cannot be the main source of the bailout in Eurozone, right? The US will not participate in that. And how come should you ask China to participate in that? Right? US can rely on printing money to handle that. China need to earn money for that, right? Those people who can pay money to help will not do that. And how far do you reply that China need to earn the money to pay European bailout?
Actually, my question, let me put it that the other way, because actually China, the share of China in World Bank is about 3 or 4%, and the IMF is about 2 or 3%. So I'm wondering, in the future, how China will position itself through multilateral organizations, or more China will go from one to one on a country level basis, or
well, that does not depend on China. That very much depends on the US, because the US wanted to give up the 17% voting right for them. Right? Because it's a zero-sum game. If China want to increase the share, some countries need to reduce the share. But all the high-income countries did not want to reduce the share. China cannot take the share from India, right? India will not give that to China. And the US will not give up. European countries will not give up. Right, what's in case then the high-income country needs to be reduced. But high-income country is a block, they don't want to reduce their share. So who should be blamed for that?
You have time for one more question.
Okay. Okay, maybe I allow two ladies to both raise their questions.
Oh, okay, thank you. Just as a general observation, people are saying, there's no statistic behind it for my question, but people are saying that in China there is a very high concentration of power and money in a small group of people, and which is not very common in all these economies that you just mentioned. How do you see this problem? Do you see